script, but I'm gonna need it.
You muted, Suzanne, you muted, oh, you muted? Now, hi there, guys. Hi, Gail.
Hi.
Hi.
Good seeing you. It was very nice last night, Suzanne.
Thank you. You guys had already left by the time we left, so thank you. It was a lot of fun.
We
actually.
left, but we got stuck in the stupid parking lot because the gate wouldn't.
Oh, do not get me started on that.
I know we have had that before, but it was raining when we arrived, so we didn't want to walk from another place. So we parked there anyway. And it turned out to be a disaster.
And then I dropped my mask as I was coming in. Fortunately, someone found it and I used a disposable one. But I'm going to miss the Monday nights. I'm wondering if we're going to be able to be in person after January.
Well, in a couple of weeks, we may be having a massive Omicron surge.
That is what is being
I think it's just a
said.
couple of weeks away.
I think
Hopefully it
it's-
will not
I think
last that
it's-
long.
I think it's sooner than a couple of weeks.
And I don't think anybody really knows what to expect. I think that that's what makes everybody so anxious.
Some restaurants are already closed because they have outbreaks of COVID. They either don't have employees or there's just it's just too risky.
And I agree. I'm very cautious about what I do now.
I skipped a party last night because of it.
Mhm.
I don't blame you.
I'm very spooked by this thing.
Yep.
Going to a party is not worth it.
It was a house party with a
No,
lot of people.
you got a lot of people in a house with a relatively low ceiling. You're looking for trouble.
Yeah.
Okay. Good
Well,
morning.
I do hope if it does become a great problem, I hope it moves pretty quickly.
Yeah, it's going to kill a lot of people very quickly. I mean, even if it's it's less damaging than Delta, the number of people who are going to get it is so high that when you multiply the two numbers, you get a high number.
Right. So we don't know yet. But they did say there are people who are fully vaccinated already in the hospitals. Here in
I
Houston,
think that those are breakthrough,
they are.
and they're much more serious than the symptoms of the Omicron.
Well, they don't know, they don't know yet. It's going to take another couple of weeks to really understand what's going on.
Well, you got to look at the numbers in Denmark. Denmark is much more vaccinated than the US, much better organized, and they're having a terrible time already.
Yeah. And the Netherlands, just as of like midnight, stores going into a complete lockdown a few days before Christmas, which is something kind of unheard of.
Yeah, Israel is also going into sort of a lockdown.
Well, they've shut the country down essentially. They've shut down tourism, any flights in and out, essentially.
I hope by mid-January it's gone. That's all I hope. It's very disconcerting. It's depressing. We thought we were, beyond this.
Yeah, we thought we were coming out of it.
Well, my birthday is January 15th, which is the middle of the month. So Gail, may your wish come true.
Yeah.
Celebrate with takeout.
What?
All
We
right,
celebrate with takeout.
so let's shift topics.
Okay.
Let's celebrate every day we have instead of worrying about, make wise choices and celebrate. instead of being frustrated. Let's celebrate together our existence and our good lives. All
That
right.
is a very good thing to try to remember.
Yep. All right. So we are up to the issue of immigration. Okay. I hear bells and whistles and all kinds of things. Okay. So the floodgates at this point of immigration, we've been talking about the fact that 2 million Jews have found their way here, and the floodgates start to close in the early 1900s. Organized labor, led by the American Federation of Labor, advocates restricting the numbers that are admitted. The advocates of the Anglo-Saxon Americans argued for restricted and selective immigration. New England Brahmins, through their Immigration Restriction League, founded in 1894, warned against the mongrelization of America. And so you've got this, in addition to everything else, these racial prejudices of Americans against Asians and South Americans against Blacks, turned the issue into one of restrictionism. By the end of the 19th century, the contending forces had joined in battle. And by the 20th century, that battle had turned into warfare. And it resembles a lot of the same issues we have today. A law enacted in 1891 provided for exclusion of physically and mentally handicapped, of the morally undesirable, and of paupers or persons likely to become part of the public charge. And so any person whose ticket was being paid for by somebody else to get here, an American, a Jew, it sponsors somebody else to get here. Anybody whose tickets were being paid for or in some way or assisted was turned away because they would become public charges. The language itself of these kinds of things was hidden. The anti-alien element is hidden. But nonetheless, most of it targeted Jews and Italians and the Irish in particular. An American correspondent to the Hebrew periodical Hamagid perceived the danger of these laws, and he wrote a report in 1891, reading number 1. All right, we've got reading number 1. Let's try having somebody read it and see if you guys can hear whatever. Okay, so Martin, you've got square 1. Would you read reading number 1 for us?
Sure. The United States of America is not what it once was, a land of full freedom, a land of one law for the native born and the stranger. The hundreds of thousands of immigrants who came to America's shores are no longer welcomed with open arms. The day is near when the gates of the United States will be closed to immigrants. The American legislature is already studying the question of immigration to determine what kinds of immigrants America should accept. As soon as they finish with the Chinese, they will turn to the Jews and the Italians and find all kinds of reasons for exclusion. The agitation against Jewish immigration is already taken on serious proportion. Who knows where it will end?
So this is written in 1891. It could have been written yesterday, right? For sure. All right, but it was written in 1891. As a practical means for selecting desirable immigrants, the Immigration Restriction, excuse me, the Immigration Restriction League posed literacy tests. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge led the enactment of a law in 1896, which required adult immigrants to be able to read 40 words in any language. Such a requirement would have excluded 1/4 of Jewish population and much more significant numbers amongst outside the Jewish population, for sure. This law, however, was vetoed by President Grover Cleveland, and they made attempts again, 1898, 1902, 1906, 1913, and 1915. The first 3 times, it was defeated in Congress. The last two were then vetoed by Presidents Taft and Wilson. So 3 times the Congress shot it down, and 3 times 3 different presidents shot it down. Lewis Marshall, whose name you're going to hear a lot today, okay? His argument against the literary test is both practical and personal. He sends a letter to the governor of Vermont and he writes, reading number 2, and Suzanne, you've got the second square. You don't have it. Okay, Gail, you've got the next square. Just unmute if you would.
An educated immigrant, can you hear me?
Yes.
An educated immigrant is not ordinarily the most beneficial. The ranks of the anarchists and the violent socialists are recruited from the educated classes. It is the illiterate immigrants who are now building our railroads and canals and subways. The Native American shrinks from such labor. Personally, I know a great deal concerning the immigrant because my parents were both of that class. The entire wealth of my father when he landed consisted of a 5-franc piece. While he was able to read and write, I am sure that he would not have been able to read fluently the Constitution of the United States in German, the only language he could read, and that he would not have understood it. And yet you are able to say whether or not he has become a good citizen. What is true of him is true of millions who have come to this country from abroad.
So what's particularly poignant to Marshall's argument is that the fact that here you have a father who could barely read and understand the Constitution. And with the arrival here in America, his son becomes one of the leading constitutional lawyers. All right, there's a personal element to this argument that immigrants who come here, the second generation, has a lot to offer. All right. On the eve of World War I, most Jews were living in urban ghettos. They're surrounded by the sounds of the Mamaloshen, of Yiddish, their Yiddish mother tongue. Little more than 30 years prior, before the onslaught of Eastern European Jewry, anything you would have heard would have been English, it would have been German, it was reform in its nature. But the sheer volume of newcomers, the sheer volume has created tensions that exist not only from without, but now from within. You have 10% of a population now that is German and 90% Eastern European. And the 90% are all new. Just, I made this analogy before, but think of Israel a couple of years ago when they had the Russian immigration in. A country of 3.5 million people suddenly is absorbing 1 million more, a third of its population or so. Now, Jews here are the people who were here to begin with now only represent 10%. It's not 2/3, it's 10%. And you can imagine the sort of tension that must have existed. World War I just exacerbates everything. Right? It's a catastrophe of the first order for Eastern European Jews, those who are still living in East European. It brings the nightmare of military occupation, along with more expulsions, hunger, and fear into the lives of those still living in Europe. And Jews and other civilizations suffer as opposing armies scourge the shtetls and the villages that are along the Russian and Poland borders, causing dislocation and economic ruin. As I listened this week to the news reports about the dislocation and the suffering in Kentucky because of tornadoes, now make that widespread to just millions and millions of people. No place to go, no homes to go to, no place to go back to. Families are stranded, families are divided. Some families tried to reunite by emigrating to America. And some simply just wanted to leave because the conditions had gotten so bad, they needed to get out. And so the wave of immigrants continued, but it's certainly at a much slower pace. As early as 1914, the American Jewish community mobilizes its resources to assist the victims of the war in Europe. Now, we didn't get involved until 1917, but by 1914, Jewish organizations are starting to recognize we have a problem. Cooperating to a degree that had not previously been seen, the various factions of the American Jewish community, the native-born, the immigrants, the Reform, the Orthodox, the secular, the socialists, all coalesced together into what eventually became known as the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. All told, now think about the times on this, American Jews raised $63 million. This is in the 1910s in relief funds, and they became more immersed in European Jewish issues than ever before. So you have a sense of the crisis that's going on. People arrive here, what do they find? In urban America, it is Yiddish. Despite all the different inflections that might come and the pronunciations that might be different from one place to another, it is Yiddish that unites the recent Jewish immigrants, even more so than even religion. All right. Yiddish was the language on the street. Yiddish was the language in the home and in the marketplace. First generation immigrants were comforted because they found something familiar in both the language and the culture, which they just shifted entire cultures right in here into America and surrounded them in the cities. Yiddish theater provided an escape for immigrant audiences. Again, everything else is foreign. And so you go to the theater to feel like, okay, there's home. Yiddish vaudeville began in the 1890s and served as a training ground for ambitious young men and women who want to success in the great American vaudeville experience. But it's a tough business. Those who are not quick on their feet, they're not clever and tenacious, they fall by the wayside. And it's only the truly great who end up coming out. And so Jewish entertainers with that experience included such as Groucho Marx, Walter Mitchell, George Jessel, and we could name many, many more. Their careers began on the streets of the Lower East Side, led them to the Yiddish vaudeville, and then to iconic fame through films, through radio, and then ultimately on television. The circumstances of the time, however, also made the immigrants ripe for another kind of literary expression, a poetry and a fiction that is blunt in speech, fiery in politics, and it breaks away from the passivity of traditional folk material. A Yiddish critic by the name of Rifkin remarks, and that's reading number 3. Eric, do you have the text?
Yes.
Please.
A huge mass of potential Yiddish readers was gathering in the city. Even if they had not wished to, they really had no choice but to learn Yiddish. It was the only language that could gradually lead them into the life of the new country. They felt themselves lost in the desert, where men seemed like grains of sand and the new language English was difficult to learn. So they naturally turned back to Yiddish, even complete illiterates. And there were quite a few among the early immigrants, as well as many half illiterates who could spell out a few words in the Hebrew prayer books, now troubled to learn the alphabet in order at least to be able to read a daily Yiddish newspaper.
So think of the irony of this. People who can't read come to America, they're living in America, and what language are they learning to read? Not English. Their culture around them is Yiddish, and so they learn to read Yiddish. Reading number 4, Joyce.
Poems and stories help them to understand their new environment, and most of all themselves. They sought in literature the same thing they wanted in a newspaper, a way of becoming somewhat less of a greenhorn, a way of escaping a little on their loneliness. And when poem and story gave them a certain enlightenment about mankind in general, the greenhorns began to feel they were becoming a little Americanized.
All right. So by 1920, there were more than 20 Yiddish newspapers published in New York alone, reflecting a variety of religious, cultural, and political views, in addition to numerous other journals that are being printed. Perhaps the most famous and the most important is what you would guess is the Forward, the Jewish Daily Forward, a newspaper with socialist underpinnings, edited by Abraham Kahan. Kahan was a Russian immigrant. He was a devout socialist and a liberal who fled to America in 1882 to escape the great scapegoating of Jews in Russia and the horrific state of pogroms after the murder of the Tsar in 1881. For the thousands of Jews who immigrated, who flooded into America during the late 1800s and early 1900s, the Jewish Daily Forward was more than simply a newspaper. It was a lifeline. It was a connection. It was an advocate and a basis of the community they were creating, and it helped generations of newcomers adjust to life here in America. It's unabashedly leftist. The paper tirelessly chronicles the hardship of life here in America, in New York's factories, its tenements, while boosting trade unionism and socialism. It had a legendary Bintel brief component, okay? This was a forerunner of Dear Abby and Landers, both of whom were Jewish, answering questions from bewildered immigrants trying to make sense of their Americanized children. I mean, they're living a different world and their new circumstances in this strange world. I want to take a second and read the next reading should be number 5, I believe. I have 45. I assume it's 5 in yours. All right. And that would be, Russell, do you have the text? No. No. Okay. Rhoda, do you have the text?
Dear Mr. Editor, I was born in a small town in Russia, and until I was 16, I studied in Talmud Torahs and yeshivas. But when I came to America, that changed quickly. I was influenced by the progressive newspapers, the literature. I developed spirituality and became a free thinker. But the nature of my feelings is remarkable. Listen to me. Every year when the month of Elul rolled around, when the time of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur approach, my heart grows heavy and sad. A melancholy descends on me, a longing gnaws at my breast. At the time, I cannot rest. I wander about through the streets, lost in thought, depressed. When I go past the synagogue during those days and hear the cantor chanting the melodies of the prayers, I become very gloomy and my depression is so great that I cannot endure it. These emotions and these moods have become stronger over the years, and I decided to go to the synagogue. I went in order to pray to God to heal and refresh my aching soul with the cantor's sweet melodies, and they had an unusually good effect on me. Sitting in this synagogue among people from the same village or town and listening to a good cantor, I forgot my unhappy weekday life, the dirty shop, my boss, the bloodsucker, and my pale sick wife and my children. All of America with its hurry-up life was forgotten.
So you can hear the pain and the suffering that's going on here, and you hear the synagogue being a place of just stepping away. Sort of what, Rabbi always talks about with Shabbat is to just put the rest of it away. Step into a new place, a new holiness. This work of helping immigrants and promoting the leftist agenda also continued off the pages of the Forward itself. The newspaper sponsored English classes, charity balls, a pro-labor summer camp, and hosted vaccination days in the lobby of its building. Gee, sounds familiar. The editor spoke at political rallies and lobbied government officials on behalf of Jewish immigrants who were detained or turned away at Ellis Island. And readers, more than just reading the news, turned around and reported news to the paper. They reported by letter and in person, often appealing directly to the staff for help. And so from the outset, the relationship between the publication and its readers was one of interactivity. By the early 1930s, the Forward had become one of America's premier metropolitan dailies, with a nationwide circulation in the 1930s of 275,000. And this influence from this newspaper reaches across the world and even into the Oval Office. Thousands more listened regularly to the Forward's Yiddish language radio station. Their byline was the station that speaks your language. I'll stop for any comments or questions. Yes, Gail.
Yeah, so the Jews were very adaptable and turned to the written word to deal with their issues. The other immigrants, the Italians, the Irish, etc., Poles, did they have something similar to the Forward?
No, and for a number of reasons, which I think we're gonna I think we'll talk about a little bit later, but yeah, if not, I'll address that. Hold on to that question. Hold on to that question. I'm not sure if I talked about it last week or it's in this week's notes. It's in my head. I just want to make sure. Okay. Anybody else? Okay. World War I officially begins July 1914, but America doesn't enter the war until April of 1917, almost 3 years later. For young American Jewish immigrants, the war provides a way to hasten Americanization. Ironically, many of these people had fled Eastern Europe to avoid serving in the Tsar's army, and yet nearly 200,000 Jews served in the US military during the war. Living and fighting together provides an opportunity for large numbers of young men of different religions and backgrounds to discover one another, to become Americans in a far swifter and more visceral way than civilian life might have allowed. One of the books I read about 2 years ago on Israeli life is look, nobody, I'm not here promoting a draft, but in Israel, where they do have the draft, you have the opportunity for economic movement in a way we don't have here. So if you are poor, but you are very bright, you get introduced to other people who have money. And when you get out, you have the potential of moving up a career. Here in America, those people never get introduced. Again, I'm not promoting a draft. I'm just making an observation for what is the outcome of where there is a draft. 3 days after the United States entered the war, the Jewish Welfare Board was established. It's an agency that is officially recognized by the War Department and supports Jewish soldiers by training and furnishing chaplains and organizing religious services for Jews in military bases and hospitals. In June of 1917, Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan, a name you've probably heard or may have heard, rallies American Jews to enlist in the armed forces. He says the ideal for which we are fighting is to suppress the great bully and outlaw among the nations, the German government. As Jews, we owe it to America to stand by her in this hour of trial. Led by America's premier lay leader and philanthropist, Jacob Schiff, a campaign begins which unites the city's Jews as never before. Orthodox, Reform, secular, socialist, men, women, children, even the indigent, all join forces under the slogan, again, this is all in New York will do its duty. And in a remarkable 2-week campaign, collected more money in that 2 weeks in New York alone than in the entire year by the entire American population in the year before. When we have problems, we come together. That's real. American Jews living outside of New York likewise raised unprecedented sufferings for their kinfolk in Europe. As I described, $63 million between 1914 and 1924. Philanthropy had become the civil religion of American Jews during this time. And by contributing to feed and to clothe and to house the suffering Jews of Europe and Palestine, American Jews found, in a sense, a collective mission, a way, in Schiff's words, to prove ourselves Jews, prove ourselves their brothers. And ultimately, those notable Jewish dissenters against America's entry into the war found themselves marginalized and even persecuted. The First World War is a turning point. It's a turning point that has a profound impact on American Jewry. The war on the Eastern Front between Russia and the Central Powers was conducted on territories that were home to almost 4 million Jews. This is this Polish and Russia border. All right. Additionally, there are suspicions of Jewish loyalty, dual loyalties that are being expressed in England and the United States in particular. Why? Think of, where did the Jews come from? Russia. Who's on the side of the Allies in this war? Russia. When American Jews voice their concerns about Russia, they're seen as being pro-German. And so when you attack the friend of my friend, all right, you have issues. The numbers that we talk about in the armed forces, also the age and the sex discrimination of the American Jewish community at this time is skewed by who immigrated. The Jews contributed disproportionately to the war. The men had come here many times. I mean, many of us have the stories. I have the story. My great-grandfather came here and worked for a decade before he could bring his family. So who's here? The men, the young Jewish men. All right, so although they only constituted about 3% of the population, they furnished 4 to 5% of its armed forces, up to 250,000 Jewish soldiers and sailors. Not one registered for the Air Force. No comments. There was no Air Force, okay? All right.
Such as it was.
To thwart those who doubted Jewish patriotism, Jews began to document their contributions. Records were kept concerning every Jew in the military, listing 1,500 commissioned officers by name, and Jewish newspapers were memorializing the 3,500 American Jews who died in the conflict. All right, we've learned from the past that later, no one remembers our participation. It's documentation what's happening. Zionism in this period. Zionism is a movement that began in the 19th century and seems to have run into a brick wall in 1914. The Ottomans were opposed to Zionism, basically preventing Zionists from immigration, at least from purchasing any land. There'll be no ownership of land. Europe is igniting into war in August 1914, and American Jews, American Zionists, hold an emergency meeting in New York's Hotel Marseille and elect Louis Brandeis, once again, the Boston lawyer, to be president over the Provisional Executive Committee. His election marks a turning point in the situation. He has vast experience as a reformer and as an organizer. And that leads him to emphasize the democratic aspects of Zionism. And in so doing, it makes this fledgling movement much more compatible with American ideals. He succeeds in bringing together existing Zionist groups under the umbrella of the Zionist Organization of America. He admonishes Reform rabbis. Remember, this time the Reform rabbis have made their world, this is our new Jerusalem. This is our new world. There's no reason to be for return. He admonishes them by saying, let no American imagine that Zionism is inconsistent with American patriotism. So again, you've got battles within. At the beginning of the war, World War I, fewer than 20,000 Zionist members existed in organizations in America. By the end of the war, it increased sixfold to 125,000. One reason for that increase is the large number of immigrants. Immigrants who brought with them their emotional and religious fervor for the cause. But Brandeis's equating of Zionism with Americanism also nullified the previous fears of dual loyalty. And so you've got this growth of Zionism within American life. Many non-Jews, as you know, also supported Zionist goals. Early Christian activity to help Jews return to Palestine was motivated by a theological conviction that when Jews are again living in the land, the second coming of Jesus would occur. President Woodrow Wilson was the son of a Protestant minister and strongly attracted to the Zionist cause on the religious grounds, and told the delegation of American Jewish Congress leaders in 1919, our own government and people are agreed that in Palestine there should be laid the foundation of a Jewish commonwealth. A few years earlier, 1916, Wilson nominates Brandeis to the Supreme Court. Never before in America had a Jew had such a highly visible and important government position. And so, as such, his nomination unleashes incredible anti-Semitic rhetoric in newspapers, in social clubs, in the halls of Congress. But nonetheless, he's confirmed for the Senate. I'm going to stop again. Any comments or thoughts? Yes, Sandy.
It took a long time for him to be confirmed by the Senate, and he was opposed, as I recall, by then Massachusetts Senator, the one you mentioned earlier. I'm sorry, Henry Cabot Lodge, and among other things, the lore, whether it's true or not, is he was very popular in Boston, where he was an extremely successful lawyer, and he or his buddies told Cabot Lodge that if you don't confirm him, he's going to run against you for the Senate. Also, Brandeis, who is from Kentucky, was not at all a religious man, but he was an ardent Zionist.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, some things don't change. Martin.
I had a question about the relative religiosity of all these immigrants. Jacob Neusner, in one of his essays on the big immigration of Jews, said that there were Jews who, as they entered New York Harbor, took their tefillin and threw them in the bay, in New York Bay, because when they got to America, they were not going to be observant. That was just something imposed upon them in the shtetl or wherever. What was the kind of balance there?
So I've heard that. Right, I've heard that. I'm certainly not going to in any way disagree with Jacob Neusner. All right. I don't honestly know numbers. Nonetheless, obviously the strong Jewish influence continued for several generations. I have to imagine it wasn't a majority, but it probably was a significant minority.
Yeah, one other comment. One of the things that was disconcerting to me going to Ellis Island and going to the Hall of Immigration and looking at the numbers from various countries is that because Jews were thought of as a religious group, one of the things we could debate at some point, when you look at the massive Jewish immigration, it's called Russian immigration because that's where they came from.
Right.
So you don't get the sense of how many Jews came to the country if you go there, because it's called Russian immigration because they came from Russia.
Right. They didn't know they didn't know how to label it.
Exactly.
Right. I had not heard that. I like that. That's very good. Thank you. Thank you. Anybody else? All right. So you probably have heard of the Balfour Declaration. Zionist hopes worldwide are raised during the war by the Balfour Declaration in 1917. Lord Balfour, who is the British foreign minister, supports the establishment of a Jewish national homeland, one, because of his personal religious beliefs. Again, this is bringing the second coming, but also because he felt he wanted to influence the American public opinion of entering the war on Britain's side. All right. He believed was so in America that he was overestimating their political influence. And so what does he do? This is what he does. He believes he can influence America by attracting American Jews. Reading number 6, the Balfour Declaration. Jerry, do you have it? Would you do us the honors?
Yes, I will. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country.
Yeah, this is a carefully worded document. As Achara pointed out, the Jews weren't moving into a land that was uninhabited. Right? There were many Arabs in the land. And so the document is crafted to satisfy Jews while not alarming the Arabs. Nonetheless, For American Zionists, it represented a significant success. For the first time, a major international power had officially recognized the rights of the Jewish people to reestablish its homeland in Palestine. Jews in America's largest cities celebrated. There were parades and there were rabbis. There were rallies. Probably were rabbis. Brandeis and Rabbi Stephen Weiss spent the summer of 1980 convincing President Wilson to support that declaration, the Balfour Declaration. And Wilson ultimately writes reading number 7. He didn't call it reading 7, I will. Jeff, if you would read reading number 7. You need to unmute, yeah. You can unmute. Okay, Sandy, would you do us the honors?
I welcome the opportunity to express the satisfaction I have felt in the progress of the Zionist movement in the United States and the allied countries since the declaration of Mr. Balfour on behalf of the British government of Great Britain's approval of the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. Just one comment, Lord Balfour's, this reading number 6, it was addressed to Lord Rothschild, who was, I think, considered the leading Jew in Great Britain.
Certainly one of the financial giants. I mean, I'm actually making a note of that. Okay. All right. On the morning, Rabbi Kaplan writes the following: this morning at 6 a.m. New York time, the Great World War has come to an end. He wrote that into his diary. But even as he is rejoicing, the ever astute rabbi is filled with apprehension. He writes, in place of wars of nations, we will now have wars of classes. Social revolution is in the air nowadays. And just look at Russia and what happened in the subsequent years, okay? This contradictory feeling expressed by Kaplan, celebration on the one hand, trepidation on the other, anticipates the great paradox of this interwar period. There was much to be joyful about. So let's talk about that first. Jews numbered among the many immigrants and their children who benefited from new opportunities in higher education and from the post-war prosperity and post-war investments. As a consequence, they moved into this broad middle class. They worked as white-collar professionals, clerks, shopkeepers, salesmen, and they lived in new and better neighborhoods reflective of this improved economic situation. A few Eastern European Jews even became millionaires. The Jewish community was also becoming native born during the interwar years. American born children came to outnumber their parents during the 1930s, with the result that for the majority of American Jewish population for the first time was not foreign born. And finally, American Jews began to feel more at home in America. Those born and raised in the country, and especially those who served in the war, developed an American consciousness and an identity. They came to feel equally American and equally Jewish. Those are the positives. Yet simultaneously, American Jews had many reasons for apprehension. In response to the atmosphere of social revolution that Kaplan sensed, fear gripped many Americans. They lashed out at immigrants. They lashed out at Bolsheviks. They lashed out at anybody seen not to conform. And so nativism, xenophobia, racism, anti-Catholicism, anti-Semitism, all characterize what we would call the Roaring 20s. Even Jews whose families had lived here for generations were feeling the sting of prejudice. The 1930s, as well you know, added depression, economic depression, to the brew, which exacerbates things greatly. With Hitler rising in Germany and domestic anti-Semites like Father Charles Coughlin ranting on America's airwaves Jews had good reason to be nervous. However much they may have felt personally at home in America, the question still existed. Did America feel at home with them? Immigration restrictions that sought to restore the nation's ethnic mix, to put it back to its 19th century white Protestant character, were also aimed directly, but by no means exclusively, at Jews. The House Committee on Immigration received a report by William Carr, the director of the Consular Service, and approved by the Secretary of State, that described Jews who desire to migrate to the United States as being, among other things, undesirable, of low physical and mental standards, as filthy, as un-American, and often dangerous in their habits. The resulting legislation never mentions Jews particularly, because it restricts other undesirables as well. But nonetheless, it has a major impact on Jewish immigration. The Asians, by the way, were barred completely. Lewis Marshall states, the hatred of everything foreign has become an obsession in America. The National Origins Immigration Act of 1924 strengthened the emergency measures passed 3 years earlier, and they confirm Marshall's worst fears. It imposes a country-by-country quota set at 2% of each nation's contribution, but it doesn't look at the population now of America. It looks at the numbers in 1890. It's 2% of the 1890 population, which is before most immigrants had come. And so what they're trying to do is restore the ethnic makeup of the time before immigration really took hold. And as a result, it hits the Jews very hard. Over this next decade, an average of 8,000 Jews a year were admitted to the United States, where prior it had been over 100,000 a year. Limitations caused great hardship to those experiencing persecution, but also to those, as we described before, who are here and trying to work to bring their families here. Suddenly, they couldn't get their families in. Later, when America faces an economic crisis in the 1930s, the already reduced immigration flow is limited so that very few immigrants were admitted, even from relatively high quota countries. And as a result, when Jews most needed rescuing from Adolf Hitler's ascension, they found America's doors barred shut. Again, I'll take any comments. Yes, Sandy.
The 1890 was not a random figure. The pogroms of 1892, 1893 set off a lot of Jewish immigration, and I believe that was chosen specifically to reduce back to what it was in 1890. Also, in a book called The Cast, which I would recommend to everyone.
Great book.
It has this, it draws parallels between America's treatment of Blacks, the German treatment of Jews, and the caste system in India. And it points out that Hitler quoted a lot from the eugenics laws and the way the US courts dealt with these issues.
Yeah, you'll hear me reference that in just a second. You're absolutely right. The flow of anti-Semitism wasn't one unidirectional.
Yeah, just to give the greatest context here, the 1920s was a time when Wilson wanted America to be part of the League of Nations, and Congress defeated all efforts to do that. I mean, we were pulling away. We were xenophobic so many different ways.
Right. So as Marshall said, the
participation on the
hatred of
world
anything
stage.
right, the hatred of anything foreign. Yep. The debate over immigration takes place against this background of heightened anti-Semitism, and it shakes the Jewish community's confidence and its strength and its sense of unease and being not a part, being aparted. As Americans grow disillusioned with internationalism, fearful of the Bolshevik subversion, and frightened that foreigners would corrupt the nation's values and traditions, manifestations of anti-Semitism rise precipitously. The president of the CCAR, the Reform Movement, states within 3 years of following the close of the war, there was perhaps more anti-Semitic literature published and distributed in the United States than at any previous period in history. And what makes this distribution of literature particularly insidious and incendiary was that so much of it bore the support of a national hero, Henry Ford. Ford was quite possibly the strongest supporter of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion within the United States. In 1918, he publishes his hometown newspaper, the Dearborn Independent. For 91 straight days, beginning on May 22nd of 1920, the Dearborn Independent describes an international Jewish conspiracy based on the notorious forgery of the protocols. He also has 4 volumes entitled The International Jew, drawn from the series, reprinted, and charges disseminated in hundreds of thousands of copies. And I have here just some highlighted comments, just a few of them. So what I'm going to do is say, let's just go around the room. Leslie, if you'll read the first paragraph, and then Russell, you'll read the second, and we'll just keep, no, okay. Leslie, read a couple paragraphs.
Okay, from the Dearborn Independent, the common criticism made against President Wilson that he, quote, he played a lone hand and would not avail himself of advice can be made only by those who are in ignorance of the Jewish government, which continually advises the president on all matters. More?
Yes.
Yeah. While the president is supposed to have been extremely jealous of his authority, this view of him can be maintained only by remaining blind to the immense authority conferred on members of the Jewish war government. It is true he did not take Congress into his confidence. It is true that he made little of the members of his cabinet. It is also true that he ignored the constitutional place of the United States Senate in the advisory work of making treaties. But it is not true that he acted without advice. It is not true that he depended on his own mind in the conduct of the war and the negotiations at Versailles.
Okay, Lisa, would you take us home?
Sure. The Jews' determination to wipe out from public life every sign of the predominant Christian character of the United States is the only active form of religious intolerance in the country today. Not content to the fullest liberty to follow their own faith in peace and quietness, in a country where none dares to make them afraid, the Jews declare that every sight and sound of anything Christian is an invasion of their peace and quietness. And so they stab it out whenever they can reach it through political means.
Please continue.
Oh, sure. Have to turn the page.
There you go.
Chief among them, B'nai B'rith's activities is the work of the Anti-Defamation League. This insight committee and every lodge attends to the espionage work necessary to keep the Grand Lodges informed as to what is going on with reference to Jewry in the United States. In its work, the Anti-Defamation League always takes the offensive. The question, continue?
Yes, please.
The question arises whether it is patriotic for Mr. Lewis Marshall to implant into the minds of his foreign-born co-religionists the idea that this is not a Christian country, that Sunday law should be opposed, and that the matter and customs of the native born should be scorned and ridiculed. The effect has been that thousands of immigrant Jews from Eastern Europe are persistently violating Sunday laws in the large industrial centers of the country, that they are hailed to court.
Let's say hauled to court.
Okay, that they are hauled to court, lectured by judges, and fined. American Jews are carrying into practice the teachings of Mr. Marshall, and his followers are reaping the whirlwind of natural resentment.
This is over the course of a year, but they had, as I said, there were 91 straight days as such. We're not talking about a world like we have today where you read it online, and we've kind of become somewhat understanding that there's a lot of lunatics out there writing. This is a world in which this is the daily paper, and there's no options. It's a local paper, and you're reading it day after day. Throughout the Dearborn Independent, Ford publishes articles that would refer to Jews in every possible context as the root of all America's and the world's ills. Strikes, it's the Jews. Financial scandals, it's the Jews. Agricultural depression, it's the Jews. As one of the most famous men in America, Henry Ford legitimizes ideas that otherwise would have fallen by the wayside. Sandy makes your point. Germans at the Nuremberg trials later credited Ford's work as a source of their anti-Semitism. What is most notable is that these works were spread through the Ford dealerships. There would be stacks of the protocols and the writings on the dealership wherever you went. In some places, when you bought a new car, it would be put on the front seat of your car so that as you drove home, you took with you all this anti-Semitic literature. You know, I grew up in a world in which you didn't buy a Ford. Just, you know, I heard that from my parents. You don't buy Fords. I'm seeing a lot of head shaking. Yes. Still don't. I'm not. Yes, indeed. Beverly says she still doesn't. Right. During the early decades of the 20th century, a disproportionate number of Jews begin to attend college universities after completing high school. Acquiring a higher education, as we've talked about on numerous occasions, was a way of achieving economic security and finding one's way into a new world. In the 1920s, some of the prestigious universities began worrying that their campuses were becoming too Jewish, and they established quotas limiting the number of Jewish students. The president of Harvard University explained that the anti-Semitic feeling among students is increasing, and it's rising in proportion to the increased number of Jews on campus. So while Ivy League schools limited the number of Jewish students, one of the ways in which it's really played out is Jewish graduates face discrimination as they try to get into graduate school. Quotas at medical schools forced otherwise talented Jewish students to enter foreign medical schools or to change their career goals. Some changed their names and just hid the fact that they were Jewish. In reading number 9, which we're about to read, it's a letter in which Harvard President Lowell writes to Judge Julian Mack, a Harvard alumnus, to inquire whether or not Mack would be satisfied if approximately 15% of Harvard's entering class was Jewish. All right, Martin, you have I'm assuming anybody with their squares off. Oh, Stanley, you have yours on. Do you have the reading?
You want me to read, Mark?
Yeah, Martin. All right. Yes, Martin, why don't you read?
Dear Judge Mack, I think we have found a way by which we can limit the Jews in Harvard to the number that we can really benefit. As I told you, I put this at about 15%. In the present freshman class, including the provisional freshmen, that is those coming from other colleges and rated as freshmen, the proportion of Jews is about 20%. No, there are 2 doors into college, which we regard as discretionary. One is the transfer of students from other institutions. These we do not feel obliged to take unless they are in certain ways desirable. We feel that a boy has a certain claim to enter Harvard College by the regular method of examination, that he does not have the same right to be transferred from another college without passing our entrance examinations. It appears that of the number of students transferring from other colleges, 30% are Jews. We have also investigated the men coming in under the new plan that would not pass all 4 of the sample examinations required, but who, taking their whole record together, have been admitted. These we call line cases. The admission of such boys who have not fully passed the entrance examinations is discretionary. Now, it would appear that in the present freshman class, if we excluded all of the clearly desirable Jews who come from other colleges and what not fully passed examinations under the new plan, the percentage would have been reduced to 15%. It seems to us that to do this would be preferable to putting any limit upon the number of any class of boys who are admitted through the regular entrance examination. Being an exercise of discretion already possessed by the committee, it would require no further action by any of the governing bodies, nor would it involve what Harvard cannot do. That is, purporting to have an entrance exams open to everyone and really excluding certain boys whom the examination showed to be intellectually qualified for admission.
So you have politics at work. We can work around the visuals of a limitation of Jews being entered by finding alternative ways of limiting their participation.
Mark, I have a comment about this. There was a book written about college admissions not too long ago that, we know now that grades and SATs and what have you aren't the only criterion used. They use leadership and sports participation and this, that, and the other. And the reason for introducing those criteria was to get around this. It was to take the academic piece in which Jews were over-competing and exclude them because they didn't have the leadership and all that and the sports prowess that WASPs had.
Why does that not surprise me?
And now that's the issue with Asian students.
With what?
Exactly what's happening with
Asian students.
Yeah. Yep.
And in fact, there's a
book was called The
lawsuit.
Chosen.
In New York City at that time, the only place really the Jews could be sure that they could get in was City College.
Right.
And they had a just extraordinary proportion of Jews.
Yeah. Thank God for City College.
That's where my dad went. Yep.
So did mine.
Well, my medical school, Albert Einstein, that was founded by Yeshiva University, the whole point was because of discrimination. That when I went, it was 98% Jewish, and large numbers of faculty were also Jewish as opposed to the other universities in New York.
Yeah.
Just as a statistic, when I was at Harvard Law School 50 years ago, between a quarter and a third of the students and a quarter and a third of the professors were Jewish, at least by birth. Many of them did not practice religion, but it certainly made its way above 15%. The other is that the Jewish hospitals around the country were started primarily because Jewish doctors were not given privileges in other medical schools, so at other hospitals. So as a remedy, there were Jewish hospitals formed. Here in Houston, there was no, but there was a Jewish Institute of, I can't remember where, the Jewish Institute of Religion in the medical center, which was funded by the Houston Jewish community.
Yeah, it was part of Baylor.
Yeah. However, 55 years, 60 years ago, I can tell you there were limits in number in Houston, Texas, because they were all in Texas, because there were only 3 medical schools. And there were limits in the number of Jews that were allowed in each medical school. I mean, in my lifetime, because I know the number in my class, and I know the numbers in other classes too. And it was even worse for women and blacks, obviously.
Yep. I'm just going to close up a little bit here. Discrimination in housing accommodations was even more blatant. If you went to resort hotels, you would find Hebrew patronage not requested. You want to know why there was a Catskills? That's why. Classified employment ads commonly added that the openings were for white Christians only. Discrimination existed in private clubs. I mean, we all have, I know in Dallas, they had the Columbia Club. The Jews all joined there because they couldn't join anywhere else.
Yeah, they had Westwood here.
That's what it is.
Westwood. Okay, I didn't, thank you for giving me a label for here in Houston as well. At the same time that they're being excluded from everything, Jews are being charged by anti-Semites with controlling everything. American businesses, they're excluded from management positions. They're excluded in fields such as banking, insurance, and public utilities. And they're confined essentially to small businesses and those large industries that were essentially created by Jews, such as film, broadcasting, and retailing. And so when you hear comments like the Jews controlled Hollywood, it's because they had no place else to go. Sandy.
Yeah, one of Henry Ford's very good anti-Semitic buddies was Edison. And the reason that the Jews controlled Hollywood is that Edison kept them out of the movie industry on the East Coast, and the West Coast was nothing at the time, so he didn't care. So they all migrated to the West Coast. And my son Edward showed us a documentary many years ago that in the early days of Hollywood, 6 out of the 7 major studios were controlled by Jewish immigrants who had been born within 500 miles of each other in Central and Eastern Europe.
And they all had been
many of them had been furriers.
Wow.
Somehow, in order to be a producer, you had to have been a furrier.
No,
Suzanne?
My father needed to take a year off to earn the money to finish college. And he got a job in San Francisco or the San Francisco area at an oil refinery. Loved the year, owned by Shell. Number one, he told me that Shell was the only oil company that would hire Jews in those days. And he loved it. He loved working for them. The thing is, he really wanted, he came back to school at NYU, really wanting to go into the oil and petrol, the oil and gas aspects of engineering. However, he could not continue with Shell, as did a very good friend of his, because at that point, everybody of his particular position had to spend a year in the Middle East. I think it was Egypt at that time. And there was no way that Dad could go to do that.
Right.
And I've always found it interesting, even here in town, so many Jewish people worked for Shell or for Shell Oil. And I can't but think that it goes back to the fact that they were not a British company, not an American company.
Well, Shell was partly founded by Jews in London.
The Dutch.
I did not know that.
Yes.
I don't know that my dad knew that.
Sandy, do you have a sense of how prevalent and how conscious Jews were in Houston about discrimination, about getting jobs in the oil companies, Exxon and the rest of them?
I don't know, because the families which I came from were all entrepreneurs, and it was perceived that there were industries in which you couldn't get jobs. There were, with minor exceptions until the 1960s, there were no Jewish boys. Certainly there was no women, but there were no Jewish boys in major law firms. And I
when
was
you entered your law firm.
Yeah, when I started in 1971, there were 3 Jewish lawyers in my law firm. I was the second partner, and now he's the outgoing managing partner is Jewish. So the founders of the law firms would turn over in their graves if they knew that there were
Yeah.
who were managing, but that was the system. And now, I mean, one of the partners in our New York office is so frum. He's Shomer Nagia, won't shake hands with a woman. So things have changed a lot, but that's the way the world was.
In the 50s, Bob had to change his name in order to get a job in the chemical industry. He sent out dozens of applications and was turned down, and then he changed his name and sent out to the same firms and got interviews right away.
Yeah.
And that was like in the early 50s.
Yeah,
my friend,
And he rose to a high position.
I need to break in. I need to break in. Two things I'll make. One is, most pragmatically, my iPad is down to about 5%, and so it's about to die. Second thing is just a comment on this. Look, we have new problems in our world all the time, but I just want to point out it's easy to reflect back on the good old days, and the reality of it is we're living in the good old days in many, many ways. And so, as much as we have all these new challenges to Jewish living and to even life here in America in certain ways, it's easy to look back and say, wasn't it better? And the answer is no, it was different. We'll pick up after the new year. I'll send out an email and look for the schedule. And I wish everybody a happy new year. May the next year be one of health and coming together and celebration.
Yeah.
Thank you for the excellent
you.
class.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
everybody.
Same sentiment.
Thank you.
everyone.
You too.
Happy New Year, everyone.
Happy New
New
Year.
Year.
Happy New Year.
A happy and healthy New Year.